Why is the US pulling troops from Germany? They've been stationed there since the end of World War II, and now Donald Trump is about to cut their number by more than a quarter. But why now? And should US allies and NATO be concerned? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Brennan. They're a legacy of World War II, a symbol of US commitment to protecting its European allies. US military forces stationed in Germany are reportedly going to be sharply reduced. President Donald Trump plans to pull out 9,500 American soldiers by September, reducing the number to 25,000. Troops will either be redeployed elsewhere or sent home. It's being seen as the latest twist in relations between Washington and Berlin. Tensions between the two sides have been strained over a number of disagreements. But defence spending has been of particular concern for Donald Trump. He's repeatedly pressed Germany to increase its military budget. And he's criticised NATO allies for relying on the US to shoulder the cost of maintaining the alliance. Well, a spokesman for the US National Security Council, John Ulyott, issued a statement on Friday. It neither confirmed nor denied Trump's withdrawal of troops, saying, whilst we have no announcements at this time, as Commander-in-Chief, President Trump continually reassesses the best posture for the United States military forces and our presence overseas. The United States remains committed to working with our strong ally Germany to ensure our mutual defence, as well as on many other important issues. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas says Berlin will take note of Donald Trump's plan. In an interview with the Bild am Sonntag newspaper on Sunday, he said, "We appreciate the cooperation with the US armed forces that has grown over decades. It is in the interests of both our countries. We are close partners in the transatlantic alliance, but it's complicated." Germany hosts the largest number of US forces in Europe, followed by Italy and the UK. The US Army was almost 2 million strong on the continent at the end of World War II in 1945. That number was brought down significantly 4 years later. It was boosted again to more than 400,000 military personnel in 1962 as the Cold War with the Soviet Union grew. But it was slashed by two-thirds after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Those stationed in Germany were gradually reduced over the years, but the country has remained a crucial military hub for the US. It's where the headquarters for US forces in Europe and Africa are based. And it hosts an airbase from which soldiers and equipment are transferred to Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, let's bring in our guests now. And joining us from Walpole, Massachusetts, is Andrew Bacevich, a US military historian and president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From Berlin is Uli Bruckner, a political analyst and professor in European Studies at Stanford University, Berlin. And from Moscow, we have Pavel a journalist and defence analyst. Thank you all very much for joining us here today. Uli, if I could start by getting some reaction there from Germany. We've had the foreign minister saying we're close partners in the transatlantic alliance, but it's complicated. I mean, those words say so much, don't they? What is the prevailing response to this move?
Well, it is not a spectacular situation. We are talking about 9,500 troops. And as you said in the beginning, we saw 6 digits of troops being stationed in Germany, and we saw the numbers going down, then the numbers are going up again after Crimea. I would not put too much weight on this particular announcement of a decision. We still have to wait if it ever happens or if it's just another threat, because last year we heard something similar from the American ambassador, that the numbers of American troops will go down. But the political Berlin keeps it low-key. As you quoted the foreign minister, it is complicated, but not because of this announcement. This is the development of a long-term trend, and we see many more serious developments in the transatlantic relationship that give reason to be concerned.
Andrew, one thing that Uli said there is quite key, isn't it? We'll have to wait and see if this actually happens. I mean, you've said in the past that Trump is a president who tends to act on impulse. We've as yet had no official statement from the White House. Do you think it's actually going to go ahead with this troop drawdown from Germany?
I think it's impossible to say. Trump does like to make headline-grabbing announcements. If there's any purpose in those announcements, I think it is that he's playing to his domestic political base. We have to remember that a presidential election is right around the corner. He had promised to end endless wars, to reduce our U.S. military commitments. He really hasn't delivered on that. So this could simply be a way of reminding his supporters of his intentions, even if he doesn't really deliver.
And does it play well to his political base? I mean, it's at best just shifting troops around, isn't it? I mean, it's not ending or withdrawing from any wars.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not part of his political base, first of all. So I'm not sure if I'm quite in a position to interpret the mindset in the Trump camp. But I would say that it does not appear that in that world, there is a very serious and thoughtful understanding of how the world is changing from a security perspective, and therefore how the U.S. posture globally ought to change. What there is, and this is what Trump plays to, is a sense that we have, the nation, United States, has borne too large a burden for too long a period of time, and now it's time for others to share some of that burden. He consistently makes that point, and again, I suspect that in the pro-Trump camp, that plays well.
Pavel, how significant a move is this being seen there in Moscow?
Well, it has been an essential kind of pillar of Russian foreign policy, well, since the end of the Second World War. It's a big attempt to get the Americans out of Europe. I mean, to weaken as much as possible the transatlantic connection. And Germany was always seen as essential to kind of neutralize Germany, build a bridge between Moscow and Berlin. And that would actually more or less secure the Russian kind of, as it's seen and is still seen right now in Moscow, as the Western front or Western direction, the направление in Russia. And so this worsening, another worsening, seemingly, relations between Germany and the United States is always welcome. Though militarily, most likely, this will, even if this withdrawal comes through, it won't be militarily that significant. And apparently, maybe some of the troops, if they're moved out of Germany proper, will be just moved closer to Russia, say into Poland. And anyway, in Germany, there are essentially very little combat troops. It's a rear area. It's logistics, but it's an important, very important logistics hub. But so this is seen more as a political move by Trump. He has done a lot to undermine American relations with its European allies and is doing more. And so that's basically good.
And Andrew, does Trump not see this? I mean, when you hear from the Russians that they like this, they like the antagonism, the arguments, the infighting, does he not see that this only benefits Russia?
I doubt if he cares. I think one of the most important things to appreciate about President Trump is that he's not a strategist. He doesn't think really in geopolitical terms. He certainly doesn't reflect on how the global order might be changing and therefore how U.S. policy should adapt. He, at this point, is thinking about the November presidential election and trying to facilitate his reelection. In many respects, although his base remains loyal, in many respects, his presidency has not been a success. If we factor in the deaths here in the United States caused by the coronavirus pandemic, if we look at the overall condition of the economy, enormous numbers of people who are unemployed. And again, if we look at his failure to make good on his promises to end endless wars, and the issue here is not simply the U.S. military presence in Europe, but also Afghanistan and the Middle East. It's really not a very impressive record. So my guess is, preoccupied with the coming election, he is making these gestures, and that's all they are, these gestures to try to make it possible for him to argue, as he consistently does, that he is a successful president and therefore deserving of a second term.
Okay, so Uli, if Trump does not care enough to maintain good relationships with Europe, with Germany and with NATO, how essential is that transatlantic alliance? And can Germany instead look more within Europe to strengthen NATO?
Well, for Germany, the transatlantic relationship is by far the most important one. And everyone across the board in the German party spectrum sees it that way. And therefore, what we saw with the announcement of withdrawing troops is, of course, another step in what Maas describes as a complicated relationship, but is certainly not the problem. The problem is that the core components of the transatlantic relationship, mutual trust, the rule of law, a Western understanding of what is democracy, what are the core principles and values, in what directions are we developing NATO, all these things have been put under enormous stress with announcements that don't really speak the language of partnership, but rather that the largest actor in the group gives commands, and it's expected that the others followed in some sort of a blind allegiance. And this is not exactly partnership, and that gives reasons to concerns. And I guess that is also partly the reason why Merkel announced that she is not willing to come to Washington for the G7 summit. And as a form of revenge, we see now an announcement of that kind.
Right. We must remember, mustn't we, that there are voices within Germany on the left-wing side of the political divide who actually welcome this announcement. Why is that?
Germany has always been seen within Europe as the country that tries to understand Russia. And when we go further east, like former countries on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, they are much, much more concerned about anything that is sent as a signal from Russia. We also have sharp criticism from the UK and certain forms of sensitivity in the left spectrum in France when it comes to relations with Russia. In Germany, there have always been voices that thought of, wouldn't it be a strategic idea to incorporate Russia and to have better relations with NATO and to try to find compromises and not this harsh, we impose sanctions, and as long as Russia doesn't show any commitment to move beyond what we have with the Minsk agreement, we should stick with what we decided after the occupation of Crimea.
Pavel, one of Trump's beefs with Germany and with Merkel is that it's too reliant on Russia for natural gas, that it's in a sense controlled by Moscow. Is it?
Well, the gas issue has been quite a contentious one. And also, of course, the Trump administration has been trying to stop the full inauguration of the new trans-Baltic northern route for Russian gas into Germany, arguing that this makes Germany is paying Russia when America is spending treasure on maintaining NATO to defend against Russia, and that this is not right. Of course, the same arguments did happen during the Cold War when essentially the first Russian gas pipelines were built into Germany. At present, there's so much, the price of gas is natural gas is actually so low that Russia does not need this Northern Stream thing. We have already too many pipes going into Europe and not enough actual desire for more gas inside Europe. But in the longer run, yes, Germany will depend more. Germany is totally phasing out It's nuclear electricity production. It will need more gas. And the gas will most likely come from Russia, though, of course, there are other places. There's the United States, there's the Middle East, there's a lot of places from where gas may be shipped. Yes, but it's not that Russia, Russia needs Europe and Germany to sell its gas because they can't even much sell it in other places. So it's not that Europe and Germany so much depend on Russia. It's an interdependence.
Sure.
Between a buyer and a seller. It doesn't mean that Germany, because it's buying Russian gas, becomes a Russian colony.
Okay. Andrew, I want to look at the significance of NATO in Germany. You spent 2 tours in West Germany to contain the former USSR. Does a military presence there today continue to deter a Russian advance?
Well, that was a long time ago. In another era. We were deterring the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. I have to say, although I have no sympathy for President Trump in a general sense, and I think that this announcement of the troop cuts was typically ham-handed, not coordinated in advance, I do sympathize with the notion that it's time for Europe to assume responsibility for its own security. The conditions that existed when NATO was created in 1949 no longer exist, just as the Soviet Union no longer exists. So in my estimation, Europe is fully capable of defending itself. Now, not for a second am I suggesting that therefore we should just, pull out tomorrow, but I think there is a need for a serious process of beginning to shift responsibility for defending Europe to Europeans and shifting, not immediately withdrawing, shifting responsibility away from the United States. We're 75 years since the end of World War II. And frankly, the United States is overcommitted. You are aware of our very difficult domestic challenges right now. We need to fix our own country. And to some degree, that means paying somewhat less attention to parts of the world that are like Europe. And I phrase that carefully. I'm not trying to suggest isolationism, we're done with the world. But there is a need for the United States to reassess its priorities. Okay.
Well, the time might be right. Let's just cast back a few months ago when NATO's Secretary General was confident that the US would not reduce its troop presence in Europe. And this is what he had to say in January.
We see questions being asked about the strength of the transatlantic bond, the bond between North America and Europe. We see that on both sides of the Atlantic. But at the same time, we see that North America and Europe, we are doing more together than we've done for many, many years. The United States is not leaving Europe. Actually, the United States is increasing their presence in Europe with more troops, more forces, more exercises. And European allies are stepping up, increasing the readiness of their forces and investing more in our shared securities.
Uli, with such mixed messages coming out of the White House, is Andrew right? Is it time for a change? Is it time for Europe to take care more for its own security?
I totally agree with what he said. We are in a different era, and global security is very different from what it used to be in times of the Cold War. But what we are talking about today is not either the United States is present in Europe or it's not. We are talking about a small portion of the American presence is either taken back to the United States or moved further east to Poland. So Germany is not less protected or anything. And it's also not that Europe cannot afford it. We are reshuffling the responsibilities over a longer period of time. It's not just that you press a button and then the German defense budget increases up to 2% of its GDP. This is an enormous amount of money. And in times like past Corona, there are many more urgent things that need to be addressed than buying more fighter planes.
Pavel, how might Russia capitalize as we're having this discussion about the future of NATO, about how much the US is involved, about even what NATO means? How can Russia capitalize on this infighting?
Well, as I said, it's more or less kind of in Russia's interest to see more different problems and discourse in the Western alliance. But there's also there's another part of it. There is the internal Russian squabbles and discussions within the Russian government, where Russia right now is also has coronavirus, has an economic crisis, has a budget crisis, and there is a lot of infighting within the Russian government on where the priorities should be. The economic so-called bloc of the Russian government wants to cut defense spending too. And so for the defense ministry and the defense industry and everything that's connected to that part, for them to continue to portray NATO and the United States as aggressively intended and a terrible threat posed there in the West, well, that's essential. So that means withdrawal is good, but I don't think that Moscow is going to be right now, Russian propaganda is going to be pressing that forward, because also want to say that NATO is terrible, NATO is aggressive, and they want to come. And that's another part of the internal Russian take on this situation.
Right, okay. Andrew, just lastly, I mean, NATO diplomats have always said that they could survive one Trump presidency. The question is, can the alliance survive two?
Well, of course, I don't know. And I hope that there will not be a second Trump administration. But you're right, if there is, if he wins, he will be further emboldened. He will, re-election will affirm in his mind and in those of his followers that he's on the right course. And therefore one can imagine, I'm not predicting, but one can imagine that would then worsen relations between the United States and Europe with regard to security.
Okay. Uli, what should then NATO's priorities be at this juncture?
Well, I think it would be naive to believe that if we do not see a second Trump administration after November, then things will all be fine. Because of what I said earlier, every American administration reminded Europe and Germany in particular that we should do more and get our act together and do more in terms of burden sharing. And so this will be on the agenda and will remain on the agenda. But NATO also has to think of what is their future role and what is the long-term plan. It was founded in times of the Cold War, and ever since, NATO was looking for a new mission. It tried several things, and it is still kind of a construction site that has to define its future mission.
Okay. Well, there we will leave it for today. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us, Andrew Bacevich, Uli Bruckner and Pavel Felgenhauer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Brennan, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.